They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us and welcome to another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
And I'm Katie Gorka.
And we're so happy to be back together again and introduce you to this week's guest. Heather McDonald is someone I respect greatly, Katie. She is such a leader in our conservative movement. She is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She's a contributing editor at City Journal, does great work there at City Journal. And her latest book is When Race Trumps Merit. You can give her a follow on X at HMD@MI. Heather McDonald is here. Heather, I'm so glad to see you, and thanks for being with us on the podcast today.
It's wonderful to be with you guys. Thank you so much.
I'm such a fan of your work, and I really would love to know some of your backstory. It's how we start every episode, but just kind of laying out for us how you got to where you are today, making all of this great content and really policy for people that would really bring some sanity back to our country.
Well, I had the great fortune of being involved in college before identity politics hit. And I was studying literature. I loved language. I loved being in libraries and reading great books. And I was allowed to immerse myself in beauty and understand the just sublimity of this tradition that was passed on to us. And I aspired to go on and become a comparative literature professor. And I quickly became disillusioned with what was going on in my field. I had actually myself gotten sucked into a very perverse type of literary theory called deconstruction. But what really got bad was in the 1980s when you had gender studies rear its ugly, destructive head and going around telling females that they should read books with a chip on their shoulder, that if they're forced to read a dead white male, that somehow their identity was at stake and they should feel oppressed, or black students that if they were reading a dead white male, they should just walk out of the classroom and feel that they're under assault from systemic racism. And the academy got more and more destructive and less connected to what it should actually be doing, which is to teach ignorant, self-involved, narcissistic students why they should be down on their knees in gratitude before this legacy of the Western civilization. So I cast aside my dreams to become a college professor. And eventually, after a stint in law school that was not because I wanted to be a lawyer, but I was interested in legal theory, questions of how you read constitutions, how you read legal texts. I ended up coming to New York and becoming a journalist for the first time. I'd not done any high school or college newspaper writing, which I deeply regret. And any of your listeners who have children that are, good for them. They are learning some of the most fantastic discipline and I hope curiosity about the world. But I came to New York a liberal by default. I was not a conservative. I had no connection to the conservative movement. I didn't know what National Review was. I didn't know what commentary was. But I started doing journalism during the revolution that Mayor Rudolph Giuliani brought to New York City, that transformed the city, that set in motion the biggest urban revival in its history by fighting crime, by fighting welfare dependency, by just saying we are not going to allow our streets to be colonized by vagrants. And I figured that my only value added, since I knew nothing about public policy, I knew nothing about political theory, my value added was going to be to go on the streets and go into welfare office, go into homeless shelters and talk to people. And what I got was a very quick introduction to some conservative truths and realities, which is what I heard from people in homeless shelters, which is government aid is a narcotic. I heard from women single mothers on welfare They should have done this welfare reform years ago. These welfare mothers are so lazy they can't even change a 40-watt bulb in their house, and they're having more babies just to increase their welfare check. These are the sorts of things that if conservatives say, oh, you're racist, I heard this from the people themselves in the system. So that really was my education in the realities of great society failures, in urban policy, the necessity of safety, the most basic obligation of government, which is to protect property and lives. And then I started sort of noticing that what had destroyed academia for me, which was the narcissistic involvement in identity politics, in saying that I should only be interested in my own pathetic identity defined by gonads and melanin, that those poisonous ideas were taking over the world at large. And that's where we find ourselves today.
So I love hearing your story. I did not know this about you, even though I've had the chance to hear you speak a number of times. But I love this because I was on a very parallel track. So I studied comparative literature in college.
Really? Wow.
Now, thankfully, I was down at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And for, whatever, by good fortune of the particular people who were there, we did not have to deal with deconstruction or identity politics. And I loved it. And when I graduated, they said, oh, great, you've done a great job. Come back and do a PhD program, which I think I would have loved. And my parents were like, heck no. So anyway, that was the end of my academic career, but I loved your story. Before I would love to dive more into some of the things that you're writing about, particularly DEI in universities. But before we go there, one of the things that I'm really interested in your story, and I think it's partly because I did follow such a sort of similar path. I was not a conservative. For me, the turning point was that I went to Central and Eastern Europe following the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was the beginning of my waking up. And then there were various things along the way that sort of educated me into conservatism. So I wonder if you would just say a little bit more. Once you started to have that awakening, were there key figures or key books that you read? What kind of helped you further along in your conservative education?
Well, first of all, despite being a liberal by default, I grew up in elite coastal culture. I'm an absolute product of everything that, the Trump movement sees as a threat. I grew up in West Los Angeles. I went to elite schools. I was still, I think, always had an instinctive commitment to meritocracy. And so in the 80s, when we became aware gradually as a culture, despite the efforts of colleges to completely hide this truth, and they continue to do so, we all started to become aware of racial preferences in college admissions, in government contracting. And that I always opposed, because as far as I'm concerned, the only relevant thing to any job, any position, is your qualifications, is your excellence. I hate it, the fact that I know that I am being chosen for various panels and whatnot because I'm a female. Being female is not an accomplishment. Being Black is not an accomplishment. Being gay is not an accomplishment. Those things should never play a role in anybody's advancement. So that, when I came to New York in 87, and that was the height of the pre-cleaned up Al Sharpton era, when he was doing his race hustles in Crown Heights and parts of Brooklyn, other parts of Brooklyn, violently anti-Semitic. And so that started to turn me. But it really was, I had never thought about crime. I remember I was so much of a liberal. I'd come back from studying, and went to England. Everybody should go to a communist country. I mean, there should be no more study abroad programs. They're completely fraudulent. All these stupid Americans remain huddled in their dorms and within themselves. They don't take the advantage of this to the possibility of learning languages. But I would be all for school year abroad programs if they were sent to communist countries. and students could actually see the reality of these ideologies that they toy with out of absolute ignorance. But I'd been to England, then I came back to Yale to start a PhD, and my lovely English Holdsworth bicycle got stolen from in front of the Yale Law School. And my view then was, well, I deserved to have it stolen because I was a privileged white girl. So I had some foggy idea that it was probably stolen by black kids in New Haven, but I had no idea how extreme the disparities in crime were. But eventually, when I went and started talking to people in high crime areas in New York City, I heard voices that were never allowed into the New York Times, which was young people saying, yeah, the police don't bother me. You know, this was the era when we were told the New York Police Department was out there just harassing blacks for no reason at all, you know, stopping them just because they were black and throwing them up against a wall. And the police department is racist and violent, even though police shootings were at their lowest level in history. And I would go to Central Harlem and projects in East Harlem, and I would hear boys tell me, the police don't stop me because I'm a good boy. You know, there actually matters what you choose to do with your life, your personal responsibility, your individual decisions are really what's going to affect your encounters with the criminal justice system. So I can't say that it was reading books. That came later. I mean, I guess the one book that I would recommend is Edward Banfield's The Unheavenly City, that is a very cynical takedown of riot ideology and the glorification of race riots. And he came up with a very interesting schema about how to think about people's success in life, and felt that one of the most important values that parents can pass on to their children is future orientation, deferred gratification, not saying, I want something, I'm going to go steal it, but rather, I want something, I'm going to work towards it. I'm going to put off going out at night and partying in order to study, get good grades so that I can later advance myself through my own education, and that the lower class is defined by immediate, wish fulfillment and the inability to control one's own impulses. So that was a book. I guess I came across James Q. Wilson, but Katie, I can't say that it was some tome that I can point your listeners to enlighten them. It really was interacting with the world and hearing a narrative that was simply not allowed into the mainstream media, above all into the New York Times.
I think traveling is the greatest gift that parents can give their kids. If you can swing it. We're of Czech descent, and I had an opportunity to go to the Czech Republic, now the Czech Republic, with my dad. And we forget that communism was not that long ago. For many of the people who are wandering around, this was a change that people are still living through. And you can tell the difference in body type and the way people hold themselves that experience communism. The young people are very westernized in the Czech Republic, but boy, the older people, there's more of a heaviness. Their eyes are downtrodden. I mean, there is a physicality that came with that kind of control. And it's really amazing to see. And you don't understand that, I think, unless you really see it and experience it, and in many ways just feel it.
I just got back from Prague in April. I was 4 nights there.
So beautiful.
And it's just, I live for the Baroque. And so Prague and Vienna and Salzburg are the Baroque gems of the Habsburg Empire. And the musical culture there is extraordinary. I mean, the whole culture is involved in this amazing inheritance. You had Mozart, premiering Don Giovanni there, conducting in the Estates Theater, and conducting the La Clemenza di Tito, also premiered in 1791, the year that he died, a few months after. But one of the great discoveries there was the Museum of Communism in Prague, that is so well done. I recommend it to anybody to go to, and they're just year by year documentation of the horrors of the assault on the private economy, on private landowners, on freedom of speech. It's truly shocking, and Americans are completely ignorant about the evil that is possible when you give people unchecked power over other people. There is a sadism that comes out when you have unchecked power that is truly horrific. So yes, I mean, I'm very grateful. I picked up languages by studying abroad, and even if you're not seeing the worst, it's also very important to see the beauty and see the best. And I live, frankly, for European culture, and yes, I mean, I know that as Americans we're supposed to hate aristocracy and venerate democracy, but frankly, the aristocrats, the Habsburg Empire, they were pretty damn good patrons of art, and I'm very grateful for the buildings and the music and the paintings that they bequeathed us.
All right. I want to bring it up to the present day because we've got a lot happening in our world right now. You wrote a great piece after the attempted assassination on President Trump, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit. So you wrote, "It is impossible at the moment to see a clear way out of America's impasse. Both sides of the political divide regard the other side as threats, and to speak plainly, both increasingly hate one another." Now, in another article, you argued that the toxic ideas were these sort of toxic ideas that are at the root of this were first spread within higher education, which I think is something that we are all increasingly recognizing. How do you feel that we're doing today? How are we going to get out of this? I mean, we talk about the fact that, we need to try to bridge the divide, start to at least see each other as human again, if we're not going to entirely agree with each other, but to stop dehumanizing each other. I, for one, am really concerned about where the universities continue to go. I don't see a whole lot to be optimistic about. Maybe the one small slice of optimism comes from the fact that on, I think, August 1st, Stanford University gets a new president who comes out of the business school. I think he's going to be maybe a little bit more reasonable than what we've seen before, but elsewhere it looks pretty dark. What do you think is the fate of the American university and therefore of American students?
Well, within the university, there is no hope. They are absolutely committed to radicalizing students and to demonizing the Western tradition. It is a very bizarre thing, Katie. This is, to me, is the puzzle of our age. Why the West and only the West is in this suicide spiral and is determined to tear itself down. The West has nothing to apologize for, at least until every other civilization doesn't engage in the same apologies. The West has given the world its prosperity, the freedom that it enjoys, the extraordinary liberation from the squalor, the suffering, the cold, the disease that was the human lot until basically the 20th century for most human beings. The ideas that the left uses to bash the West of equality, tolerance, rights, these are all Western ideas. No other civilization came up with it. And it is the universities that are teaching students to hate their own tradition. No other civilization. We have to realize this is a very, very weird thing. China does not go around apologizing for China's actions in the past and saying it needs to atone and submerge its native population with unchecked mass illegal immigration. Africa doesn't do that. India doesn't do that. Only the West wants to put itself out of existence. And universities, I was at Yale at the height of deconstruction, and I was too foolish not to be skeptical about it. And it did start something that's a philosopher named Paul Ricoeur called the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is to think that, authors are trying to put something over on you, and there's a subtext that is either undermining the work itself or is claiming, is showing the racism and sexism of the own book that you're reading. And that is now, that attitude of suspicion is rampant in universities. Every literature course sets out to show that this book that you may think is showing you the tragedy and the sublimity of human life, and with wit, and irony, and the challenges of marriage, the challenges of love, of being a child. In fact, what it really is about is masking Western colonialism and imperialism and slavery. That is the dominant attitude in universities now, which is that anything that the West does should be deconstructed and shown to be a mere smokescreen for white supremacy. So the universities internally are not going to change. But I have to say, I'm a pessimist by nature. Unlike you guys, if you're in the media, you have to be upbeat because everybody wants to have a positive message. I'm generally deficient in that. It's hard on my speeches to say, but we're going to win. But actually, I am more optimistic than I've been in a long time because of red state governors. I think that they are finally realizing that, for instance, these insane demonstrations, mass cult hysteria in favor of Hamas did not come out of nowhere. And it's wrong to characterize it as anti-Semitic. It is anti-Western. That is the product of the university. It's a feature, not a bug. Mm-hmm. And the governors are starting to realize that, and they are trying to do what they can to shut down the DEI bureaucracies, which is not enough. The DEI bureaucracies are furiously renaming themselves. And even if you were to extirpate those leeches that exist only because of racial preferences and exist in order to make Black students understand their academic difficulties, which result from racial preferences, not from racism. But the DEI bureaucracies exist to tell Black students you're victims and you should be angry and resentful, rather than to tell them the truth, which is that the reason you're in these universities is they want you so badly that they've admitted you with qualifications that would be automatically disqualifying if presented by Asians and whites, because your test scores are so low. The DEI bureaucracies contribute to racial hostility and tension. The red state governors are starting to push back on that. Sometimes they may be going a little too far, but I think that is a very, very promising development. And I think we just have to continue calling it out and continue to refuse to declare the West guilty of things that every other civilization has tried and oftentimes accomplished. The only reason that some civilizations have not accomplished, the occasional, the colonialism, the domination that the West did accomplish, yes, it was engaged in very brutal warfare. Every other civilization has wanted to extirpate its enemies. They simply lack the technological means for doing so.
Moving forward down this road of DEI and where it's gotten us as a society, it's not just the government institutions, it's not just educational institutions. We're seeing right now an issue in law enforcement where, first of all, there's many factors. Law enforcement does not feel supported anymore, so you have a lot of good officers who are leaving the force. You have those openings being filled not by the best and brightest, but by people who are checking boxes, and we're lowering our qualifications for that. And as we talk about the biggest story that we've had this week, the attempted assassination of former President Trump, a lot of questions are swirling around the Secret Service, not just about the ineptitude or maybe the mistakes made, but also about the actual Secret Service protection around President Trump. And Katie and I were talking before we started recording, Heather, about the agents that are around President Trump, who he speaks very highly of. Eric Trump speaks very highly. I don't feel bad about women being in the Secret Service. I think it's great. But when you are protecting someone, it's important that you match their size. And what we're seeing is that there were a lot of women who did not match the size and stature of Donald Trump around him. And there were definitely either protocols not followed or we're still learning. But what do you make of DEI as it relates to law enforcement, and even more than that, Secret Service protection of some of our most important figures in the country?
Well, the idea that explains about everything in our world today, Jen, is disparate impact. And that applies especially in race, but it also applies with sex matters. Mm-hmm. And I assume that the Secret Service used to have certain height requirements, and they had a negative disparate impact on women. How many women are 6'2"? And so anything that kept out achieving some kind of, or moving towards some kind of ridiculous, unnecessary, irrelevant gender parity would have been thrown out. I disagree with you. I do not think women should be in any kind of first responder roles. I don't have a chip on my shoulder. My self-identity or sense of accomplishment, which is not high, is not dependent on seeing quotas of females in the rest of the society. And I don't need a female role model. I think people should choose role models based on the accomplishment of scientists, of leaders. And if I were a physicist, I wouldn't need a female role model physicist. I would choose Einstein. So I don't, the sight of those ridiculous females around Donald Trump with their breasts and their fat, rolls around the waist, it's preposterous. We don't know. Now, maybe most of the threats are going to be gunshots, but if they ever need to take somebody down, a female is not going to be able to do that. It's the same thing in policing, and it's the same thing in firefighting, and it is sure as hell the same thing in combat units. And I don't know the tactical decisions that were made about the perimeter, whether affirmative action, racial preferences, sexual preferences were involved there. But I'll tell you this, anytime there's a female put in the top place of an agency at this point, I am going to assume that she's there because of her sex. I'm sorry, that is just the reality. That is for sure the case with the outgoing commissioner of the New York Fire Department, who it was ludicrous. She had no firefighting experience whatsoever. And like this Cheadle, the head of the Secret Service agency, she made her mission to be proportional hiring. LGBTQ, blacks, females, has nothing to do with firefighting.
We have that in LA too. Our police chief, not the police chief now, but the fire chief certainly is prioritizing all of those things, Heather, in Los Angeles as well.
It is insane. If you're a firefighter, you've got to be able to carry your buddy out who weighs 200 pounds and he's wearing another 100 pounds in equipment from a burning building and the stairwell is collapsing under you. Females do not have the body strength for that. It's insane. And of course, this is the flip side of the trans athlete insanity, but we don't need to go there now. But in any case, I don't know about Cheadle and whether she was a affirmative action hire, but when you have the President of the United States saying that he is choosing Supreme Court justices on the basis of race and sex, he has put in his first year and a half 24% of all of his federal picks for the federal judiciary were black females, which is way, way overrepresented. Black females make up about 2% of the nation's lawyers. And when you add to that the fact that blacks, because of racial preferences in law school, end up overwhelmingly in the bottom 10th of their law school class, about 50% of black students are in the bottom 10th of their law school classes, you are asking for mediocrity on the bench. So I would not be surprised if the pick for the Secret Service agency from Biden was also based on her sex, not her competence. And that we cannot afford that. I mean, what's it going to take? And we see this in medicine as well. A friend of mine was telling me yesterday about a friend of his who had his wife, the friend's wife, was having terrible headaches, just awful head problems. And finally she got a doctor who diagnosed her as having an aneurysm. And he said, "You're about to be operated on in an hour." They caught it just in time. Do we really want somebody who has failed a medical licensing exam 5 times and is being pushed through medical school because he's Black to be that doctor who does not necessarily have diagnostic skills? We keep playing with fire, and something has got to change. We have got to turn around and say the only relevant qualification for any job is your skills. And I, for once, also had a spurt of optimism yesterday between Vance and Trump. I rarely allow myself to hope, but if they get elected, maybe there is a chance that the federal bureaucracy will be reamed out of the identity hires, and we will ream out the numerous requirements to hire, to give grants, to give medical grants on the basis of race and sex, not on the basis of medicine. Trump didn't do it his first term. There were many things he was trying to do, but he allowed the federal science agencies to continue prioritizing the irrelevancies, the stupidities of race and sex in their medical awards and in their hiring. This time around, my guess is Trump will take it on, and we will move very deliberately and significantly back towards being a place where the only thing that you need to have in America to get ahead is accomplishment, not the trivialities of being of a certain color and having a certain type of sex organ.
Heather, we are so lucky to have you as an incredibly brave and wise and smart voice in this movement. And I encourage, for those who are listening, if you're not familiar with Heather's work, you can follow her at City Journal. You can read her books. You are just such an asset for us, and I am really excited to see what comes next. So thank you so much for coming on and talking with us.
It's been so great, Jen and Katie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Heather McDonald is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor at City Journal. And the latest book is When Race Trumps Merit. You can follow her on X at HMD@MI. Always great catching up with you, Heather, especially in a long form way. Thank you so much for what you are doing for our conservative movement, for our country, actually, even beyond that. All right. Thank you all for joining us. Another episode of Happy Women in the Books. Here's a few things for you to do. Homework assignments. Get Katie Gorka's book right now. It's called Next Gen Marxism. You can get it wherever your books are sold. We were even talking, if you're listening this week, Amazon Prime Week is here. You can even save a little money if you go and buy the book today. And of course, make sure you check out our website, katiegorka.org. You can search for Catherine Gorka on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram at Jennifer Horn Radio on Instagram and Facebook, and at Jennifer Horn on X and Truth Social. Of course, if you'd like to follow us, and please leave us a review on Happy Women. 5 stars, always appreciated, and add us to your regular listening routine. SalemPodcastNetwork.com. Thanks for joining us. It's another episode of the Happy Women Podcast.